there's a tendency to resort to very minimalistic behavior in an attempt to counter this system, which is something that everyone's in support of. You know, there's the old saying that you should act with your dollar, you should vote with your dollar. That's sort of the propaganda you get within the monetary structure that, oh, if you don't like this company, you just don't use them, as though that's actually a solution, as though the system doesn't reinforce pressures to move towards, say, the worst manufacturers because, well, they're most cost efficient. You can actually afford this stuff. That's just why the green economy is so hilarious, because all the really healthy and sustainable products being produced without all the negative, unsustainable practices that are out there are actually the most expensive. So it's just comedic to me that you have to be more or less well-to-do to be socially concerned. As I stated in my Toronto lecture, caring is a convenience. I mean, it's a luxury to care. And that's something I think people forget when they attempt to describe how you're supposed to just act, oh, don't support this GMO or blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really work that way when the pressures, the externalities of our lives come into play, because we're all in deficiency in this model. So with that said, it's a very tough question. And I think that, as Brandon pointed out, you have to just begin to act in your own way. And I think contribution and development towards the model very specifically is the best way to go. And I recommend, if anyone hasn't seen the Toronto lecture, it's also in the book, but I detail 2 big projects that anyone can participate in. It doesn't take a whole lot of knowledge to do so that can actually create the foundation of this type of social model that we put forward. So I'll leave it at that. But it's a very difficult subject.
It's making people feel powerful enough to act on the change which
right.
they know needs to be
That's
done.
a very important concept that I'm glad you brought up, because in a movement of this nature that's so grassroots, we get a lot of language that is that we're leaderless, and that's kind of come back to bite us in a bit, because the term leader also means to go first. And what's happened is I've seen people afraid to step out and go first because they're afraid, oh, I don't want to be seen as I'm trying to be a leader. And we actually need people to go first. So I would encourage you to watch your language around leadership and to really encourage other people, if they're good at something or if you're good at something, to not be afraid of stepping out and going first, because that's exactly what we need. And the people in this room are going to support you in doing that when you're advocating this train of thought. And the thing is you may not feel like a leader in this room, but when you go to work, maybe you're the only person who is thinking about these ideas. Or when you go to the gym, maybe the people you interact with there. So please be a leader, and I want to encourage you to do that, and to be careful not to pull down people who are stepping up. I mean, we've certainly had that to different degrees of people worried, like, oh, you're too visible or something. And we don't want anybody to get an ego about this. This isn't about us as individuals.
This is a selfless movement.
It's right, but we want to be sure that people know that we want you to go first. We want you to, and there's an infrastructure behind you, even if it's not there with you in the moment. So we do want to encourage that, and I hope that you will help me in doing so.
In regards to action, I say we should build the new world in the shell of the old to whatever extent possible, but to keep in mind that the whole point of that old world is to make sure that that new world that you want doesn't happen. So we need to also go farther than those minimalistic approaches in our own lives.
Okay, cool. Sarah's, sorry.
Information that's been brought up, we understand the monetary situation. We are in this paradigm. I know what we can do as individuals. Solutions are out there. How do we affect public policy? How do we work with the system to affect change?
Anybody want to take a crack at that one?
It depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to ease the stress of the current model, it's a different path than it is to move towards the new system. The new system has to come from a completely grassroots place, because I don't know why any corporate or government establishment would ever find motivation. They're working within a model that is absolutely against everything that we're talking about. So again, back to developmental projects, creative projects, virtual projects, I think is the best way to go. But I will say that there is going to be a point where everyone is going to have to start doing something to counter the negative byproducts of this system, regardless of our interest in a new system. And this is something I've rarely talked about. In my Toronto lecture, I had about 15 minutes prepared that I was not able to complete because it was overrun in time. But I talked about a hybrid economy very loosely. And that's just something I will mention briefly here. It's something that everyone should think about. How would you use policy to just be more sustainable? Now, there were about 7 different points of this. I'll just give you one. There used to be, Bell South was the original phone manufacturer in the States, and they would lease their phone to you, basically. You basically just had the phone, and you used their service. But they owned the phone. And you could throw that phone down a flight of stairs, it would never break. I have one, actually. I could throw it off my roof. It's not going to break. It's not like a cell phone. It's not like anything that's made today out of the absolute cheap, most cost-efficient materials. You create a leasing structure you mandate a leasing structure for everything created. So let's say Apple, they have a 10-year lease or, say, warranty, 100%. They have to make sure they guarantee everything they make for 10 years. You see Apple change their behavior very, 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 very rapidly. If they had to actually replace, update, and design things to be updated, understand technological development and the exponential increase, Moore's law, they would begin to think about what it means to actually keep things together so they would reduce their costs because it would be their responsibility. That's one thing, which I think it actually would be a very amazing thing to put forward as a mandate for corporate America, just an absolute law that says you are responsible for X number of years. If anything happens, you are going to take the reins to fix it or repair it. That would be a great first step.
Yeah. Also, I understand your question because I did before the Zeitgeist Movement even existed. I was an activist for many years for anti-war, environment, trying to change public policy to no avail. But there is a transitional period right now where there are some things that are worthy of supporting in that transition. For example, the first country has a guaranteed life wage now in Switzerland, where you get a guaranteed income for no work.
They don't have it yet, but we're working on it.
Working on it, on the way. But as an example, or for example, Marianne Williamson running for Congress, but she was not taking any money from anyone, as an example. Not that once she can get in, she's going to be able to change everything, but just efforts like that are towards something, because obviously we want post-monetary, post-need for all of that anyway, political. But in the meantime, there are things on state levels that are making a difference. Look at gay marriage. I mean, that was through policy that people kept at it, and it's helping, But of course, we look at the bigger causal issue of being post-political altogether. But I think there are worthy efforts in the transition,
I'll make one other point that I think, from an evolutionary standpoint, I think it's also in the book. I think this might be relevant in the future because that word ephemeralization, doing more and more with less and less, what that will enable will be countries in the future that will be off the grid, so to speak, from globalization. I firmly believe that. They will develop an internal structure where they don't need to trade anymore on the international level. And with that, there might be a possibility they decide to actually become increasingly efficient. They apply these old socialist ideas, but in a high-tech way. I could see this happening in the very lush regions of Latin or South America, and they just break themselves off. And they set the first precedent as a country that maybe doesn't have any money, maybe is actually using technical means to distribute to meet all human needs and all the things that we talk about. If that set the precedent, that would be amazing. It could also happen in a small community. We don't promote just small communities where people go off the grid and live in lo-fi ways. I love open source ecology. I love all these lo-fi possibilities out there, but it's not really going to solve anything in the long run unless it is indicative of the technologies that we're trying to employ. And it's just a matter of time before 3D printing and the programming stuff will come to a point, become so accessible, become so cheap, because that is the sort of unique paradox of the whole thing. And as an aside, it's the one thing I think about that could actually save this system. The only thing that could possibly save this system is the advent of technology finally reaching that point where it's so cheap it's able to keep it together, but it would never improve it. It would just keep it this flat line of misery, but just enough survival. And that scares me. I call this in the book the techno-capitalist apologists. Because these are the guys that really, they're Kurzweil Institute people, they really believe that the market system can prevail with all this technology. They're missing the entire foundational premise of what actually the system is defined as, what it really does. So it's this new advent of the next 50 years, the technology will become more and more abundant and cheap, and I think people will be able to get off the grid in much more radical ways where they can literally detach, in fact, from the political system after a certain point.
And what's important with those off-grid communities is also for them to eventually become federated. So when one of them falls, they can help each other out with mutual aid. Because one of the reasons why these lifeboat communities, if you will, fail in the past is because they haven't federated with each other. It's sort of isolated.
Yeah.
So, Gore Vidal said, "It's not enough to succeed, others must fail." So, there are a lot of elements to the human psyche that are populating Earth right now. Besides ours, there's faith-based ideologies, greed-based ideologies, individualism. The system is perpetuated by that narrative, which is supported by many of those systems. If we can kind of psychoanalyze those who benefit from the current system, it's people that probably you can certifiably say are narcissists, arguably even psychopaths. The system rewards narcissism and psychopaths, and so the system itself is psychopathic, obviously. Now, obviously, the greedy individualists, like, not greedy individualists, like anarcho-capitalists like Stephen Molyneux, who you actually totally beat in that debate, I want to add. The irrational fundamentalists, they have their actual personal identity tied into perpetuating the system.
Yeah.
So, they stand to lose if people like us, and for the world for that matter, actually stand to win.
Something that where we all will win is in the overall health of the society in which they live. See, this is thinking about everybody living in a bubble, okay? So say you're wealthy. You don't live in a bubble. You're not immune to the environment and the socioeconomic system and the other people and the whole thing, the city that you live in or wherever it is. You are part of that system. And everything that goes wrong, the lack of integrity in that system, the environmental degradation, the increasing stress levels, the increasing cancer rates affect everybody, rich and poor. You know, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm a Mac fan. I was, sad the day Steve Jobs died. He's billionaire, not immune to cancer. So the problems in this system translate out. So what's in it for them? Increased health and well-being, increased capacity of our technological capacity for everybody. Look, are they really going to be bummed out if 1 billion people start starving? I mean, it's like, it just, no. Unless they really are a psychopath. But, it's like, yeah.
To build on that, which those are all great points, I'd say it's less psychopathic and it is utterly antisocial. It's just antisocial. We live in an antisocial society. It's not a social system, it's an antisocial system. It's completely predicated on the refusal to acknowledge that there's a community issue, that we share a habitat. And with that, as Jason pointed out, the chickens will always come home to roost one way or another if you have unsustainable practices. No one is immune at all. And I think the one thing I'd add to that, though, is the power issue, which I think is what the real fear is, because this whole system is based on power. If you have a lot of money, you have freedom. It's I just watched a recent documentary, and this artist referred to it as, he's like, I don't have any fuck you money, referring to the fact that if you have enough money, you can just say, fuck it, I don't have to deal with any more of the nonsense that I've been putting up with my entire life, because you're actually free. And I think if people realize what that actually means, they would change their values accordingly. Not to mention, they would begin to think about their relationship and be more satisfied with the true foundation of what human happiness is, which is that relationship to everything else around you. That's what success is. And that's what people have lost. They've become so desensitized and dehumanized. And I think people would regain that. I mean, what was the great quote in the Scorsese film, The Wolf of Wall Street? He goes, money just doesn't get you a nicer car or a better house. It makes you a better person. Because you can donate to your favorite charity, you can save the spotted owl if you want to. And that is the sickness. That's the idea of this artificial sense of relationship, which is why people look up so heavily to the Bill Gates of the world. And they're not bad people, by the way. But they persist within a model that has elevated them to such an extent artificially that I think at the end of the day, you can't really qualify them as being empathic or humanitarian in the position that they're in for many different reasons. So I'm deviating a little bit with that, but I think the true value of what it means to relate will eventually be realized by the people with immense power and wealth, and they'll begin to see the error of what they've been doing for so long when it's no longer reinforced, when we stop looking up to them. I mean, that's the big issue. I mean, how many people would really feel great about their billions of dollars if everyone hated them for it? I don't mean that to say you should hate people that have a lot of money. They don't know any better. But imagine if you finally built that ethic of, you have a 50-room mansion and 2 jets parked. It's a form of violence. If you instill that value, that you're distorted if you really think you need all this. And look at what you're doing to everyone else. You think everyone else can live this way? What about CO2? What about all the poor people surrounding you? And you're hoarding billions of dollars of food in your bank account that I actually be given to people and say pretty much the whole time. What was the statistic that the richest 10 people could solve poverty 100 times over? It was like something ridiculous out there. I mean, how people can read that and be in that class and not feel absolutely guilty, it blows my mind. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Sarah, go ahead.
And all the information that the Zeitgeist Movement promotes, if that is what human nature is, then how would it be difficult to convince people of their own nature if you just ask the right questions in person?
Right.
Culture's too powerful, though.
I mean, I would have to say if that works, then asking them should make the difference.
That's like asking a drug addict to stop doing drugs, and they're just going to stop doing
Which-
it.
No, but like I said the emergent wealthy elite. I believe that if we,
You think that they're more socially conscious because they're younger?
I do,
Okay.
because they're more receptive to ideas.
That might be true.
It's like
Them-
a child, he's more
Right.
open to learning, but an old man, he thinks
Yeah.
he knows what he's doing because he's been on this ride for too long.
There could be a communication project that you could create to try and find people like this and bring them here. I mean, let us work on them. So,
Well, I think I know what you're saying because even someone like Russell Brand is talking about what we're talking about without saying it. He's not saying the Zeitgeist Movement, but everything he's alluding to in all of his speeches is about this this unifying consciousness going on, that people want to do something, they feel connected to their environment, but they don't know how to live in a post-monetary world. So I think you're right. It could be with a lot of young entrepreneurs that do feel that connection more with their environment. Go ahead.
Passing it down.
I would stress that what we're doing here for everyone else is equally important because you have to understand that the idea that we need a wealthy person to convince people means there's a monetary incentive to the information. And I think that that could help in the micro level, but from a standpoint of actual change, we need the value system to change, and we need people to actually disconnect from we need money in order to. I'd like to see people thinking, and it may happen in a micro level. Well, I can give this example. On the East Coast, when the hurricane came through and Occupy stepped up where the Red Cross did not, they actually became the network that is sort of illustrating what we're talking about. And I think, unfortunately, it might be those kinds of circumstances that bring people to come to that. But it was that value system that, okay, we need money and we need authorities. No, wait a minute, we have resources. So it was a different way to orient, and they actually accomplished quite a bit just from connecting with each other and making things happen and not waiting for government intervention, not waiting for somebody with money to sponsor the relief effort. They organize. So I would say it's a good idea to try that, but I think you're going to also need to do, what we're doing here to reach as many people as possible with the information.
And I have to agree with everything that you said. However, you are misunderstanding that I'm saying we need people with money before we act. And what I'm saying is no, because
Okay.
we're acting, we need to unite the people that have money, because you cannot deny that money is a tool that has the ability to erect things like a vertical farm. You misinterpreted what I said in the
Okay.
sense that I'm saying we need wealth.
No, we understand.
Now,
Yeah.
Sure.
This is just my passion. Like I said, we're all selfless. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
No, the first thing I'd ask for is if you get someone with some wealth that wants to help us out. My website for the movement needs a lot of work, and I could use some of his funds.
The system doesn't incentivize it, though. We were talking the other day, me and Phil, about the people that have enough money to literally feed the entire world. We just kind of went over this, but the system doesn't incentivize it. It would literally be not good for the economy, right? I mean, industry would suffer, economies would suffer, real people would suffer from actually taking care and solving problems. That's the whole.
It would be
Relationship.
such a foreign thing to do. It'd be absolutely contradictory to every ethic of any market-minded individual to spend, say, $1 billion to make a vertical farm to what? Give it away for free? Give the food away for free? I mean, I would love to meet that billionaire eccentric, by the way. They might exist, but
This is not a billionaire eccentric. I said that it is an emergent
Right.
wealthy
No,
elite.
sure,
But
sure.
what I'm saying is, yes, there's a lot of people that have been indoctrinated into this train of thought. But isn't human nature more powerful than the indoctrination of this society's false belief system?
I'm not sure if I understand your language clearly. This is a cultural phenomenon. The human nature will kick in once the collapse inches farther in, and people wonder that of great wealth why there are 10,000 people slowly trying to push their gate over because they have no more resources. The pressures of the system are going to manifest themselves one way or another. The human nature aspect will be the realization that fear, the fear of collapse of society, fear of ecological collapse, fear of having absolute rampant pollution. These things will be the pressures that will move forward, most likely long before some subculture of young entrepreneurs decide to say that you're going to do some funding for sustainable anything. But even if it's sustainable, they're going to want to make their money back in some way. And that's the question I ask you. What is their incentive in this model to do that? Just because they want to be nice? They're going to give it away? Do they have that much excess? So it's the human nature thing you keep bringing up I don't understand. And this has nothing to do with human nature within and of itself. It has to do with the fact that there's too much cultural inhibition, and the structure of the model of the system doesn't reinforce anything that you're suggesting.
This is good because it kind of segues into my question.
Okay, good.
So, if the Zeitgeist Movement defines itself as an education-based movement, what actions can individuals take outside of this forum to achieve these goals? Or maybe a more succinct way of saying it is, how can we live these values given the social-cultural paradigm we operate under now?
Yeah. Partly that's up to you, really. I mean,
I'm working on it.
yeah, I do what I can within the means that I have. I mean, I have to go submit to employment most of the time, so I have enough available funds to do things like this, you know. But how that looks like is really based on people's creativity. It's a non-linear question, and you're looking for a linear answer. Okay. It's like how do we get there? Is a non-linear question. You're looking for a linear answer. So what does it look like? Well, it's like, what's it going to take? You know, it's like it might take enough people to change their value set. Okay, then you start breaking down to the next question. Well, what could I do to impact that?
So from this room, I'd like for those of you who are involved in nonprofit efforts or efforts that you would consider transitional in your spare time to raise your hand. You don't have to say what it is. Okay, so your question should be directed to each one of these people to get the answer, because that's really the answer, and this is a great illustration.
Okay, so maybe I get restate my question.
Sure.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about the life ground.
Yes.
And I find that the way a lot of us are affecting activism is attempting to get back at the life ground, like urban gardening and gardening being my favorite example. But it's a tough transition, and it's a slow movement. And I would love to see more discussion of that. And I think the Zeitgeist Movement is the best place for that around right now.
Do you want to say something?
Go ahead.
I think the phrase "get off the grid" is the best possible thing you can say. And to stop the movement of money in whatever form possible, to further compound the pressures that are occurring naturally through technological unemployment and all the population gravitations that we're seeing, where there just isn't enough employment to go around. So rather than endure that, try to find alternative systems that can continue to slow economic growth, which will put pressure on the system to highlight change and of course, bring up solutions. As I stated earlier, there are modern technological means to get your house completely off the grid. You have to have a lot of money to do that now, but over time you won't. And if you really think about how to do it, live in a less consumeristic manner. Try your best to repair things and to be conscious of sustainability, as we've talked about before in this sort of patchwork generalization. But if everyone did that in a dedicated way, you would see a greater awareness of the problems that are emerging in the general population, and therefore the seeds get planted as to, okay, what do we do? Because eventually it's going to be the point where all the traditional economists and all their nonsense and propaganda about economic growth and what we need to do this and that and removal of government and blah, 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 that's going to fall flat and no one's going to buy it anymore, especially when they can't meet their needs and they're wondering why their kids are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and why they're $100,000 in debt. All the general deficiencies that this system creates that I could go endlessly on about. And with that, as long as the movement continues its pressure, I know it sounds redundant and boring, but the movement continues to have its pressure, create its chapters, reinforce the chapters don't burn out. We say, this is what we're doing. We still have our day jobs. We're still active charity, trying to do things, reduce consumption, be sustainable. But the moment this engulfing movement really presents itself, people are going to see it, and it's going to explode. And then the new value shift will occur instantly because people will realize what's possible. They'll realize what we can actually do. Now, the in-between of that is an enormous gray area. No one can answer that question. I bring it up only with my concept of individual countries going off the grid from other countries or small communities that are high-tech, that are actually having the values put forward. And not to give it away, but my new film trilogy depicts just that.
Try and get that real quick.
So just to go back down towards, because you're saying outside of, the movement, outside of this forum, what can we do? Right. Outside of the flyering, outside of creating chapters, outside of your own understanding of these issues, wearing it on your sleeve, so to speak, and talking about this stuff, talking to people do change. I've had friends that I've talked to about it but just about the awarenesses and about the understandings and the values and how it's self-realizing when you reference this stuff from a certain perspective. It's there's a logic to it. So that there's this ongoing social interaction that we all perpetuate every day. I see it all the time. I mean, here's an example. I just want to give an everyday example. You're driving around and you see someone and some car pulls in front of them or something, and that's like just so bad that it's like so frustrating for them. They throw their hands up and like they just give them a bad look, and it's just so unnecessary, and so it has such an effect on our environment. It really continues this cycle of like antisocial behavior and like not connecting to each other, and just it continues that cycle. So it's just that it can be that simple, like just choosing to like be more pro-social and be more like understanding of each other. It's like wouldn't even take that much, Jeez.
That was me that cut you off. So.
There's one thing that just popped in my mind that I think is important to recognize historically, and that's the fact that at no point in history in this massive, what is essentially a class struggle, which has been going on for however long, I mean, it was most embodied by Marxism and then the Bolshevik Revolution. Underneath the surface of that was this battle between the owners and the workers and who has the rights, and this sort of moral relativism came forward, and that is held through. It's ever apparent now in the world with the highest level of inequality by some estimates than ever before. Yeah. And the difference between now and the history of this class oppression, this inherent bigotry that's been existing, is that we can actually see that it's not necessary. We can actually scientifically prove that these resource allocations are actually wrong and non-beneficial and violent because there's no reason to have the offset anymore because of ephemeralization and the ability to create a global abundance, a very high abundance, and to live within the balance of sustainability. So it's not like everyone has everything. You can't do that. And once you take the sustainability algorithm of nature and you mix it with the population and realize that social stability and ecological stability are right in the middle of it, the logic is absolutely codified. And that's what was never occurring in the early 20th century when these types of arguments were put forward.
It's like math.
Exactly. Right.
And just touching up on off-grid communities and why I think they're such a powerful transition tech is the way they disempower violent safety nets that we're dependent upon while we build new non-violent safety nets.
Yeah. Also, if there's scarcity within any off-grid community, you're going to see the same behavior patterns repeat themselves. So, matter of fact, at some point I wanted to look into what was that city in the Emirates that they built?
I don't remember the name.
Madagascar? No, there was some $4 billion or $400 billion city. You had to buy in to live there. It's supposed to be an off-grid city. But at some point, I do want to go and look at what happened because there were hundreds of billions of dollars put into this high-tech version of a commune, basically, to see what were the challenges and did they really succeed as far as changing behavior. Or did they bring the outside cultural baggage inside their high-tech community and end up fighting with each other and whatever in the same manner? I have to look that up, but it comes to mind as a high-tech example that needs some investigation.
Like everything you talk about is like for mankind to create like a utopia. You know, I mean, that's like, seems like the bottom line, just
No.
like unified.
Hang on a second. If you go through everything in this room right now, if you actually read every piece of material, if you read, we are not, there is no utopia in anything we're talking about. And we don't promote a utopia, we don't talk about a utopia, because that is a fixed, final, static destination that doesn't exist. It's a myth, it's a fantasy, and that's why we don't play around in that land.
That's good, because it seems.
We live in a state of perpetual deficiency with a global population that doesn't even know they're in it.
Yeah.
That's the real elevation, is to a real society that's collaborative, that's working, that's efficient, that's sustainable. A real society isn't utopian, it's just real.
It was touched on by so many people. It's like, how do you treat the underlying cause of all of the problems? Is the fear. It's the fear with everybody. So it's the lack of not having. It's just the fear of not getting what you want, losing what you have. Whether you're a billionaire or whether you got 2 cents and a cheesy cracker. You know what I mean?
Is there?
Well, I'll say this before.
To get people to wake up and stop being AKA douchebags.
So you're.
People are going to have to realize what's possible, and they're going to have to have courage. Everyone's going to have courage when it comes to any kind of change. Look at the civil rights movements across the world. These guys were fearless. Gandhi walked up against little man, walked up, a whole tribe walked up against guys with batons and got the shit beaten out of them over and over and over again until the other people got bored. So this type of stuff does have that element of courage, by all means, where you're going to have to, and that's why the global community is so important. No one individual can make this change. You have to have the global solidarity, build this movement out, and it's holographic. We come to each other's aid. By the time, say, hopefully in 10, 15 years, there's so many chapters, there's so much strength that if anything moves against any one section of this movement, other movements can respond and draw awareness to it. That's the beauty of having a global movement. We work in numbers. The power for this type of change is only in numbers, and then the fear will subside. Because if you're in a group and you're in support, you're going to be much less fearful. If you're alone, clearly you're going to be more fearful.
You hear a lot of alarmists like that things are really later than we think they are, and that if we wait for critical mass, it'll be too late. So how do you address the urgency? Like, how do we address that with fracking, global warming, climate change, ecocide on a massive scale that's happening rapidly, and it seems like it's spinning out of control? How do we address this? It seems like there's a greater sense of urgency than maybe some of us in these activist organizations possess, because we want to proselytize and try win people over, and so how do we address the great sense of urgency?
I know other people are itching to answer that. I'll just say really quickly that the pressure of these failures are what energize critical mass. I wish it was easier. I wish it was an educational thing where people could just infer and know what to do next in mass, but that's not how humans tend to operate. Things have to get fairly bad for people to motivate, unify, and then overcome. And I think that the hope is that there's going to be an equilibrium at some point where the things have gotten so bad that there's going to be a movement like this that energizes so many people. Look at Occupy. It came out of nowhere because of imbalance. I mean, that happened fast and rapidly. A little disorganized. I think its imprint was a great poetry, but what they didn't have was an actual structure to implement. They couldn't answer the question of what do you really want? And that's where we've come in, and that's why I think the next time something like that happens, it's going to be much more focused and targeted.
Under the current frustration that so many people have with all of our contemporary systems, we all seem to be sharing that as an undercurrent. And with Zeitgeist offering solutions that are increasing the reach, reaching more and more people, millions upon millions of people are finding another way of looking at their systems that they've gotten used to. Chris Hedges in East Germany, when he was reporting in East Berlin, he met with the leaders of the resistance in East Berlin in the underground, and he had a long interview with them. Within a few hours of that meeting, and they were discussing possible solutions, maybe within a year or so, we'll have some gateways to the west. Within a few hours of that meeting, the wall was being beaten down with clubs. They didn't know. The leadership didn't know that it was about to happen, that spark had occurred. So my question to you is, what are your hopes that we'll reach a tipping point now in our current society where broadly systems are going to be overturned and reinvented?
What are our hopes? Go ahead.
Well, obviously, we're banking on it. I mean, that we're optimists here for that scenario. May not even happen in my lifetime, but that doesn't mean it's not a valid thing to pursue. So I guess we're all for that.
I'll just take the broad view really quickly as far as what's being banked upon. That's a new age of enlightenment. A new dawn of scientific realization that has been basically cloaked over and shut down by materialism and consumerism and individualism. A new age of actually recognizing what the world has to offer as opposed to what we're trying to force upon it. So that's my broad distinction. I think the other issue of banking on is like things like Occupy and all the signposts that are happening across the world, coupled with the biosocial pressures. I think a spontaneous type of explosion has been on the edge for a long time. Occupy was a little echo, a little hint. And I think it's going to be global, and I think it's going to be extremely powerful once it hits.
Actual activist roles and projects, you cover the chapter structure in the book, but I wanted you to briefly just describe the Global Redesign Institute, the Localized Solutions Project, and the Collaborative Design System, and just tell us how activists can get involved in those.
Okay, I'll do it really quickly. The infrastructure online has not been created yet. There are some sites up loosely, but they're not in form. I put a call out in my Toronto lecture for people that want to help with programming of these things. I've gotten about 24 programming responses, which is really phenomenal. A lot of people local, too, that have been wanting to help. Global Redesign Institute is a macroeconomic approach to total surface, topographical, you'd call it, revision of Earth. Macroeconomic in the sense that you take the broad relevancies, broad attributes of society, that have relevance to us, such as where energy is, for example, and you build around the most sustainable energy structures. So if you're in an environment that's near really efficient or really high efficacy water energy, then you construct the society based on the expectation of that. It's a self-evident, self-generating logic when it comes to what it means to have an efficient. So in other words, in a property society, you have all this stuff in globalization. So you produce cotton in America, it gets shipped to Indonesia to make clothes, it's shipped back to America. 18,000 miles of polluting tankers taking something back and forth, wasting enormous, I mean, one of those tankers pollutes about 50 million cars a year just to do something because they're saving money on slave labor. That stuff's gone. You put everything linear. Why not? I mean, that's what real logic is you put a proximity to everything. So that's the Global Redesign Institute rule in a nutshell. The Localized Solutions Project is what is in the Global Redesign Institute. So how do you make a really efficient home? How do you make a solar panel array? How do you have heat pumps, the highest technology? How do you add 3D printing if we're at that stage yet where it's actually relevant to have a garage with 3D printing? How do you make your own produce? How do you get completely off the grid and be as sustainable as possible? That's Localized Solutions Project. And then the collaborative design system is the actual brain of the whole thing, which is talked about at length in some algorithmic form in the book. And that's basically to show how decisions are made through algorithmic processes that filter human contribution to creative design. So in the future, you actually have people designing. That's the new market, is design. You go to school and you learn how to design and engineer. That's what people would want to do if they're interested in that. Not everyone has to design. I mean, not everyone in this room designs computers and cars. We accept what others do. So for those that do want to take that engineering route, there's this interactive system that's like an open source design-based Linux project. If you think about Linux as a logical design, millions of people worked on it, no money, and they made an amazing platform OS with just volunteers. Imagine if you apply that same logic to actually creating products like this microphone, and you had everyone in the world, no patents, no proprietary knowledge, and they were able to make it digital form, because you can test things now. When people make cars, they actually test them digitally. They can test crashes digitally. It's amazing what you can do now with synthesis virtually. And that will be the new market. That's where everything is created. A huge database and catalog across the world of all goods are created. Again, highest efficiency possible. And the filtration system, this is where the algorithm comes in, assures highest level of sustainability based on the current state of affairs on the planet through monitoring and, of course, basic logic about what it means to be sustainable, self-generating logic, as we know, and efficiency, once again, which means how do you do the most with less and less and less, all completely calculatable at this stage of our awareness. So those three things set in motion really is the natural law resource-based economy, which is why they're so important.
3 more minutes. We've got a few more minutes. We'll take another question.
Our system has created quite a police surveillance state recently. And that's the only thing that I could see may impede or stop our efforts. Or is the system going to, it's going to fail anyway, and that doesn't matter. I'm sure that's probably the answer.
We have so many ways for people to access this information now, don't we? If you think about it. I hope they're reading all of my emails. I really do. Because they live in this planet, on this planet too. I mean, if they've got to be, you know, wondering sometimes, like, oh my God, I have to go to the job again, you know, slugging it, and, you know, I have family stuff I'd rather be doing, and what, you know. Yeah, are their kids going to be healthier? Is there going to be clean water for them to drink? Are they going to get this disease that I know is going on because I read somebody's email over here? You know, I'm just saying, you can look at it as, you know, somebody's tapping in and that's a really bad thing, or you could look at it as, hey, you know, I couldn't pay to get this many people on my Twitter feed to talk about these, but they might be seeing all these keywords about resource-based economy. You know, I mean, it's popping up everywhere. We have to find out what this is. And so I would say that's another way to look at it.
Hopefully they downloaded our PDF.
And I also want to point out something that not many people think about. It's one massive scare tactic. If you were a major dominant power, would you not want your population to think that you have total and absolute control over everything they're doing, can watch everything? So to the extent that they have, that is very true, but then again, there are trillions and trillions of messages being sent every single day. And I guarantee you a lot of them just get archived and there's just no point. But they do like the idea of it. So don't think that when you hear this press of Obama and everybody, you know, in the CIA, they're like, oh, well, you shouldn't have done that. We can't believe these Snowden leaks. No, they like this shit, okay? Just keep that in mind.
So.